Well, I trust that the conversation around the table went well. Let's come to the second part of our talk this morning, and I want to talk about husbands and wives now. We talked a little bit more about to the church, but now Paul has some words to say to us as husbands and wives in that example of what it means in the church to submit to one another. And I want to start with husbands, partly because I am one, and I feel very well qualified to talk on this subject, but also because of the fact that we always start with wives, because the text comes there, and then we end up so focused on the wife part that we miss the fact that Paul actually spends more time and more energy and more sort of stringent regulations about what it means to be a husband. So, and let's dive in at verse 25 to what Paul says about being a husband. He tells husbands we're to love our wives as Christ loved the church, and then he begins to give a picture of that. And so you've already read it, so I'm just going to dive in. He says, love your wives. We need to know that the word that he uses here is agape. And agape, when you get right down to the root of it, means we learn to love irrespective of merit. Now that we could just take a whole couple of weeks on, couldn't we? That I learned to love Shelley, husbands, we love our wives, irrespective of merit. So this isn't, as they get older, we're looking for a new model. Or if something happens, the house isn't clean. All of a sudden we're trying to figure out, no, it's got nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with who we are and what's happening with us. Paul goes on and he says, as Christ loved the church. So he gave himself up for his bride, the church. Now, another whole series could be done on that. What does it mean that Christ gave himself up? We look at Philippians 2, where he considered himself nothing and became humble, even humbled himself to become a human being. And so there's this giving up of all that was deserved to him to become like, to come to our level, to forego in order to become like us, to communicate. So for men, we need to take Christ as the model and begin to say, what does it look like in my marriage for me to surrender my rights? Surrender or submit my dreams and my desires. I live now for Shelley's sake, not just for my own. I love the story of the university president that at the height of his career, when his wife got sick, gave up all he had worked for to come home and be alongside her and care for her in the midst of illness. Husbands, love your wives, agape your wives, giving yourself up for her. And then it says, making her holy. Well, again, this is Christ as the example. Who of us can ever live up to Christ's example? But what does it mean? Well, making her holy has those two big words, justification, sanctification. Justification, Christ paid the price to redeem the church. So for us, what does that look like? Completely it means that we're to forgive in every circumstance. And not just sort of say, oh, it's okay, but forgive, letting go of things, not holding it over our wife, not bringing things up again, not counting it against. And sanctification. You know what that word means. It's this not just forgiving and letting it go, but helping to become better. Not because we're elite, but because God made our wives to be beautiful and special. And our task, as Christ helps the church to become more like him, our task is to help our wives to become everything that God intended them to be. Helping them to be the person that God made them to be. Why do we do this? We do it for Christ's sake, because Christ loved the church this much, which literally means that in the way that we learn to love our wives, we're bearing witness to who he is. The text gets into kind of a peculiar thing there about her body and husband's body and then the body of the church, and that's what it's after. You know that in sexual intimacy, for guys it's about the physical component of that. It's even about a sense of power. But for women, it's mostly about emotions. It's about that feeling of security and a sense of being adored. So for us in the midst of that, you guys, we have to learn that I need to treat my wife in such a way as I am respecting her, not using her, but respecting her, making her, helping her to become the very person that God intended for the sake of the church. Well, there's so much more we could talk about with husbands, and we're going to get into a whole series after Easter on relationships, and we'll dive back a little more deeply into some of that. But let me make just a couple of comments about wives before I get you around the table again. I'm not qualified to talk about wives, and it would be so much better if a woman was talking about this at the moment. But for today, give me a couple of minutes to talk about it from a certain perspective. Verse 22, wives, submit to your husbands. As husbands submit to their wives by loving them, wives, you're also to submit to your husbands. It's interesting that Paul spends over twice as long talking to husbands as he does to wives. But what does it mean in verse 22 that wives are to submit to their husbands? Well, first, it's in the context of every one of us submitting, right? So this is not just on wives. But for women, it's a spiritual discipline. It says in the text, it's an example of how they learn to submit to the Lord. He receives it as a gift from them. Verse 23, it talks about the husband being head of the wife, and that's been such a problematic text. But Gordon Fee does the best job for me in describing that. You see, Romans, when they went to war, marched in hundreds, 10 rows of 10. So I want you to think for a moment of the big brute guys that were on the front and the side and the back and the other side, however many of those it was. And those were the ones that carried the big shields. But all the smart ones, all the ones that were quick and competent, were in the middle. And so when they were attacked, they would all cloister together and the shields would come up by the big brutes and he would protect. But those that were attacking, those that were clever, were in the middle. They submitted to those in the front line to be protected, and then they played their role. That's what it means to be head. Head was those that carried the shields. Wives in the same way submit, for we need you to do the things that you're capable of. And in fact, I think there's a bit of irony in this because it was actually the ones that were submitting that were the more capable ones in that picture. In verse 24, he tells why again. It's because of this fact that when you do this, wives, when you submit to your husband, you're doing it as to Christ. You're submitting in a way that bears witness to the reality of God at work in the church. Why? Well, skip with me to verse 33 and we're just about done here. It says, wives, respect your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. Wives, respect your husbands. Now, what does that mean? It means something just simply like this. I know that when I've come home from a day of work and it's been a tough day, something didn't go right, or I've worked too hard on this, or, there's just some stress and anxiety. The whole world can be against me, but if I walk through the door and I know that Shelley thinks I'm worth $1 million, nothing else matters. There's a sense of respect. What does it look like? Public affirmation. Public affection, like holding hands, notes. It just makes his world feel a little bit more at peace, which is really the biggest part of respect. Help to find a way for shalom to be part of your husband's life. Well, we need to stop. Remember, this is all in the context of community. We submit to one another. And Paul says that right there at the end. This is a mystery. And of course, I'm talking about Christ and the church. Well, we're going to pick up the next week when Dan talks to us about kids, parents and kids, and that whole relationship and how we do this submitting stuff at work too. So have some more conversation around the tables, and then we'll go on with the gathering this morning.